Welcome to my channel. Let's make a deal. If you feel even a little creeped out while watching this video, you'll give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Things are only gonna get scarier. When I was 10 years old, there was an old 2-story mansion across from our house. Its roof was covered in moss, the shutters always seemed locked, and its windows looked out at the street with empty eyes, as if the house itself were a living creature, watching everything around it. A woman lived there who everyone in our small town knew as Mrs. Lombard. She looked as if she were already 90 years old, if not older. Tall, gaunt, with skin the colored aged parchment. She always dressed in black, and her eyes, deep and dark, were like holes into a world no one wanted to look into. They said Mrs. Lombard was a witch. Of course, we children found this thrilling, but every time I saw her through the window, a chill ran down my spine. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but there was a threatening grace in them. My window faced her house. On the second floor, she had an attic, and every night I saw a light flickering in the small round window just under the roof. One night, when I couldn't fall asleep, I got up and went to my window. The moon shone especially brightly that night, and I clearly saw Mrs. Lombard. She stood at her window, her back to me, doing something on a table. I couldn't make out what it was. Her movements were too quick and chaotic. She bent down, straightened up, and waved her hands like a conductor directing an invisible orchestra. Something on the table gleamed, perhaps a knife or a metal bowl. My childish imagination immediately conjured up gruesome images, potions, curses, rituals. I watched her for a long time until she suddenly stopped. As if sensing my gaze, she turned her head sharply toward me. Our eyes met. I froze. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight, was terrifying. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes black as an abyss. Her barely breathed. She stared directly at me, unblinking. Then her lips began to move. She was whispering something, and although I couldn't hear her words, it felt as if I could feel them inside me. My head began to ache, and my heart pounded as if it would burst out of my chest. I jerked back from the window, fell onto my bed, and pulled the blanket over my head. I couldn't sleep all night, terrified she would come for me. The next morning, I told my parents everything, but they just brushed it off. "You're just overtired. Stop staring at that house before bed," my mom said. But I couldn't stop. Every night, I watched Mrs. Lombard, and every night she did something on her attic. Sometimes I saw her raise her hands, and the light from the lamp cast shadows on the wall that looked like enormous claws. Sometimes I noticed movement behind her, as if something or someone was there with her. It couldn't have been a person. The shadows were too large and unnatural. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore and told my best friend Tom about it. Tom was the bravest boy in our class, and of course, he immediately decided that we needed to find out what was going on in Mrs. Lombard's house. "Let's go in there," he said. "If she's really a witch, we'll uncover her secrets." And so, on one dark, moonless night, we sneaked into Mrs. Lombard's yard. Her gate creaked as we opened it, and I almost ran away, but Tom grabbed my hand and pulled me along. The house looked even scarier up close. Around it, weeds had grown wild and bare. Black branches crawled up the walls. We circled the house and found a door leading to the basement. Tom opened it and we went inside. The air smelled of damp and decay. The floor was covered in a layer of dust, but there were footprints, bare footprints leading upward to the stairs. We followed them. The staircase creaked under our feet, and each creak sounded like thunder in the night silence. When we reached the attic, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The room was filled with strange things: dried herbs, bundles of bones, bottles with liquids of various colors, old books with leather covers. In the center was a table with a huge black book lying on it. Next to it was a knife with a blade gleaming in the dim light. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that. In the corner of the room stood a mirror. In it, we didn't see our reflection. Instead, we saw Mrs. Lombard. She stood behind us even though we hadn't heard her come in. Her face was twisted with fury, her eyes burned like hot coals. She stretched out her hand, and I felt The air around me grew heavy, as if someone were squeezing my chest. Tom screamed, grabbed my hand, and we ran. I don't remember how we got out of the house. All I remember is the feeling of panic and terror. The next day, we learned that Mrs. Lombard had disappeared. Her house stood empty for many years until it was demolished. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel her gaze on me, as if she's still watching from another world.